Atlantic City, March of 1982. At Caesar's Hotel and Casino, on a Saturday morning when most of the weekend crowd is sleeping off Friday night, a young man in an unremarkable jacket is sitting at a baccarat table with $200,000 in chips in front of him. He does not look like the kind of person who belongs here. He is 26 years old. He has a quiet face, a forgettable appearance, the general aspect of someone who works in an office and takes the bus home. His fiancée is back in Toronto, at the apartment they are saving to furnish properly. He has told her he is visiting a friend. He has been here since Friday evening. He has not slept. He has barely eaten. He has, in the last 14 hours, moved approximately $300,000 across this table in both directions, and the net result is that he is now down considerably more than he arrived with. He does not look distressed. He looks focused, in the specific way that a man looks focused when the alternative to focus is a thought he cannot afford to have. His name is Brian Molony. He is a loans officer at the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce in Toronto, one of the most respected financial institutions in Canada. He is considered by his supervisors one of the most promising young bankers in the branch. He has a gift for numbers, for credit analysis, for the particular discipline of understanding risk. He has also, over the past 2 years, stolen $10 million from that bank. Not 10 million American dollars sitting in a vault somewhere, not transferred to a Swiss account, not funding a yacht or a sports car or a second life in another country. $10 million fed, hand by hand, chip by chip, across the tables of Caesar's Atlantic City into the mathematical certainty of the house edge, and gone. Every dollar of it. Gone the way money goes when a man with a compulsion and access to a bank's accounts decides that the only thing that matters in the world is the next hand. This is the story of Brian Molony, the most ordinary-looking man ever to commit one of the largest one-person bank frauds in Canadian history, and the story of how a casino watched it happen in real time and calculated that the most profitable course of action was to keep the game going. It is a story about what addiction looks like when it is wearing a tie and carrying a briefcase and approving loan applications, and nobody in the world suspects a thing. It begins in Toronto, Ontario, in the 1950s, in the specific texture of a comfortable, unremarkable Canadian middle-class life. Brian Molony grew up in Toronto in a household that was stable, orderly, and entirely without the kind of dramatic deprivation or dysfunction that tends to feature in origin stories of this kind. His family was neither wealthy nor poor. He was educated, he was quiet, he was good at school in the specific way that makes teachers describe a student as dependable rather than brilliant. The kind of student who does the work correctly and completely, and without drama, who does not call attention to himself, who proceeds through the system at the pace the system expects. He studied at a Canadian university and gravitated toward finance and accounting. He was good with numbers in a way that felt natural rather than effortful. He understood balance sheets and credit structures and the logic of interest rates with the ease that some people understand music. Not as a foreign language to be learned, but as a native tongue. The banking world recruited him. The Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce hired him. He was assigned to a branch in downtown Toronto and began working his way up through the credit and loans division. By his mid-20s, he was considered a genuinely promising officer. His superiors noted his analytical precision, his ability to assess credit risk, his reliability with complex loan portfolios. He was, in the language of institutional advancement, on a good trajectory. He had a fiancée, a woman named Joanne, who knew him as a careful, considerate man with a stable career and appropriate ambitions. He did not drink excessively. He did not keep disreputable company. He was, by every visible measure, an extremely boring person in the best possible sense. The first bet is always harder to trace than the first loss. Somewhere in the late 1970s, Brian Molony discovered gambling. Not in an obvious or dramatic way, there was no single night, no introduction by a dangerous friend, no casino trip that a wiser version of himself would later identify as the moment everything changed. It came gradually, through the unremarkable channels by which most addictions begin. A little, then a little more, then a different register of need that the little and the little more can no longer satisfy. He started going to the track. Horse racing was accessible in Ontario, socially acceptable, and provided the specific experience that Molony, without knowing it at the time, was looking for. The compression of consequence into a brief, irreversible moment, the seconds before the result, the particular electricity of money on the line. He was not a social gambler. He did not go with friends, did not make a day of it, did not treat it as entertainment in the way that most casual bettors do. He went to bet. The betting was the point. The amounts escalated. This is the mechanism of gambling addiction that researchers describe with clinical precision, and that every gambler in the grip of it experiences as something more personal and more urgent than any clinical description can capture. The bet that produced the sensation last week does not produce the same sensation this week. The amount must grow to maintain the effect. The process is essentially identical to the tolerance mechanism of chemical addiction, with the same arithmetic result. More, always more, requiring more. By 1980, Brian Molony had a gambling problem that exceeded what his salary at the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce could support. He was earning a professional salary, comfortable by most standards, insufficient by the standards of what he needed to feel the thing he needed to feel. The gap between his income and his gambling appetite was real and growing and required a solution. He was a loans officer at a major bank. He processed credit applications. He had access to account structures, to the mechanisms by which money moved through the institution. He understood, at a level of technical precision that very few people outside the banking system achieve, exactly how the controls worked and, crucially, exactly where the gaps in those controls were large enough to walk through. The fraud began in 1980. It was not dramatic. It was systematic, methodical, and almost elegantly simple in its basic mechanism. Molony used his position to authorize loans to fictitious borrowers or to divert genuine loan proceeds, routing the money through accounts in ways that were designed to look, on any individual examination, like legitimate banking activity. He was not breaking locks. He was using keys he legitimately possessed and turning them in directions the institution had not anticipated. The amounts in the early months were modest, tens of thousands of dollars, large enough to fund several trips to Atlantic City, but not large enough to trigger any automated alert or attract the attention of the audit functions that were supposed to catch exactly this kind of activity. He was careful. He was precise. He was doing, in the service of his addiction, exactly what his banking skills had trained him to do. Managing risk, understanding systems, staying within the parameters that kept the machinery running without producing an alarm. He discovered Caesars Atlantic City somewhere around 1980, as the new casino industry in New Jersey was still finding its footing. Atlantic City had only legalized casino gambling in 1978, and Caesars was among the first major Las Vegas operators to establish a presence there. For a Canadian living in Toronto, Atlantic City was accessible. A flight to Newark or Philadelphia, a drive down the Atlantic City Expressway, and you were there. Close enough for a weekend. Far enough from Toronto that the risk of being seen by anyone who knew you was acceptably low. Molony went the first time and found exactly what he had been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. Baccarat primarily, some blackjack, the table games where the bets could be large and the hands came fast and the experience of consequence was continuous rather than episodic. He liked the pace. He liked the scale. He liked that at Caesars, a man with money to spend was treated with a specific kind of regard that his quiet Toronto life did not provide. He came back the following weekend, then the one after that. By 1981, he was flying to Atlantic City almost every Friday evening and returning on Sunday night, in time to be at the bank on Monday morning in his jacket and tie, reviewing loan applications. A man whom nobody in that office could have placed at a baccarat table 48 hours earlier. The casino noticed him. Of course they noticed him. A player who arrives every week, who bets large, who loses consistently and comes back anyway. This is, in the casino industry's taxonomy, a gift. His casino hosts cultivated the relationship with practiced professionalism. The credit line was extended, then extended again, then extended to a level that, under the regulations governing Atlantic City casinos in the early 1980s, required a degree of due diligence about the source of the funds that does not appear to have been rigorously applied. By mid-1981, Molony's credit line at Caesars Atlantic City was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The casino was flying him down from Toronto on a charter. The rooms were complimentary. The meals were complimentary. The attentions of a casino host whose job was to ensure his comfort and continued presence were continuous. He was, in the casino's calculus, a valuable relationship to maintain. He was also stealing from his employer at an increasing rate to fund the relationship. The amounts grew through 1981 with the momentum that reflected both the escalation of his betting and the escalating confidence of a man who had been committing fraud for over a year without detection. He had proved to himself that the controls he was circumventing were not catching him. That proof was, paradoxically, a form of permission. Not a moral permission, but a practical one. The permission of continued impunity. He took more, he lost more, he took more again. There was a night in the autumn of 1981 that people who later reconstructed the Molony story describe as a kind of inflection point. A session at Caesars that ran across an entire weekend, in which Molony sat at the baccarat table for the better part of 40 hours, with breaks measured in minutes rather than hours, and in which the money that moved across the table ran into 7 figures. He won at points during that session. Winning was part of the structure. The wins were what kept him seated, what fed the conviction that the mathematics could be overcome if he stayed long enough, that the reversal was always pending. He left that weekend down more than he had arrived with. He flew back to Toronto on Sunday night. He was at his desk Monday morning. By the beginning of 1982, the total amount Brian Molony had stolen from the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce had crossed $10 million. The figure in Canadian currency represented an extraordinary sum for the early 1980s, the equivalent of many multiples of his annual salary, multiplied across every year of a full banking career. It had been taken not in a single transaction, but across hundreds of smaller ones, each individually unremarkable, collectively catastrophic. He had also, by this point, developed a relationship with Caesars Atlantic City that was producing unease in some quarters of the casino's management. The amounts he was betting and losing were large enough that reasonable questions about the source of the funds were being generated inside the institution, even if those questions were not being pursued with the urgency that the answers would have demanded. He was a bank employee. His salary was not consistent with the scale of his play. The casino had a regulatory obligation, under New Jersey gambling law, to conduct due diligence on high-volume players that raised questions about fund sources. That obligation, the subsequent investigation would establish, was not being met. The arrest came in March of 1982, but it did not come from the casino. It came from the bank. The Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce's internal audit processes, working through the loan portfolios that Molony managed, began generating irregularities in early 1982 that could not be reconciled with legitimate banking activity. The discrepancies were not tiny. They were, on examination, enormous. The accumulated residue of 2 years of systematic fraud. An internal investigation was initiated. The investigation identified Molony. The bank contacted law enforcement. He was arrested at Caesars Atlantic City, not in Toronto, not at the bank, but at the casino, where he had gone that weekend because going to the casino was what he did on weekends. The agents who arrested him found a man who, by the accounts of those present, did not express panic or attempt to flee or make any dramatic statement. He was quiet. He was cooperative. He answered questions. He had the demeanor of someone who had, on some level, been expecting this moment and was almost relieved that the waiting was over. The legal process that followed was thorough. Molony pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison in Canada, the sentence reflecting the scale of the fraud, the extended period over which it was committed, and the institutional damage it represented. He served a portion of that sentence and was released on parole. The Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, for its part, recovered a fraction of the stolen funds. The money was gone in the specific way that casino losses are gone. It had been converted into chips. The chips had been bet, the bets had been lost, and the proceeds had been absorbed into the operating revenues of Caesars Atlantic City. There was no vault to seize. There was no asset to liquidate. There was the ledger of the casino's winning sessions against Brian Molony, and those sessions were over. Caesars Atlantic City did not emerge from the affair unscathed. The New Jersey Casino Control Commission, the regulatory body that governed Atlantic City's casinos, investigated the casino's handling of the Molony account and found that its due diligence obligations had not been met. The casino was fined. The fine was significant by the standards of casino enforcement at the time, though modest by comparison to the profits the casino had generated from Molony's losses. The investigation also prompted a broader examination of how Atlantic City casinos handled high-volume players whose financial profiles raised questions, and the regulatory framework for player due diligence was subsequently tightened. The story might have remained a regional news item, a Canadian banker, a New Jersey casino, a fraud case, had it not been for a journalist named Gary Ross, who spent years investigating and reconstructing the full account. His book, published in 1987, entitled Stung, drew on court records, regulatory documents, and interviews to produce the most complete picture available of what Molony had done, how he had done it, and what the casino had known and when. The book established the definitive account of the case. In 2003, the story was adapted into a film. Owning Mahowny, the title referring to a fictitious version of Molony's name used in the screenplay, starred Philip Seymour Hoffman in the central role. Hoffman's performance was one of the most discussed of that year, praised for its refusal to make the protagonist either villainous or pitiable, for finding instead the flat, focused quality of a man in the grip of something that has entirely colonized his attention and left no room for the emotions that ordinary life expects. The film was quiet, precise, and genuinely unsettling. It did not explain the addiction so much as render it visible. Brian Molony, after his release from prison, did not return to banking, which was the outcome that was never seriously in question. He entered a different kind of work, eventually, and in ways that his story made him specifically qualified for, working in the field of problem gambling counseling and education. He spoke publicly about his experience. He worked with organizations that address compulsive gambling. He became, in the years after his imprisonment, a person who used what had happened to him as the material for helping others identify and address the same compulsion before it reached the scale his had reached. He was, by the accounts of people who encountered him in that work, genuine about it, not performatively repentant, not building a brand from the wreckage of his crime, but quietly and practically useful to people who were earlier in the same trajectory he had traveled. Joanne, his fiancée, had known nothing. This detail, which emerged clearly in the investigation and the book and the film, is perhaps the most humanly clarifying fact of the entire story. For 2 years, while Brian Molony was stealing $10 million from his employer and losing it at a casino in New Jersey, the woman who shared his life noticed nothing. He came home on Sunday nights. He was present. He was attentive. He was, in the visible dimensions of the relationship, a normal person leading a normal life. The gambling existed in a sealed compartment that did not leak into the rest of his existence. Not in his spending habits, because the money went directly from the bank to the casino without passing through any domestic account. Not in his personality. Not in any behavioral signal that she later identified as something she should have read differently. The compartmentalization of his addiction was, in its way, as impressive as the fraud itself. Both required the same quality, an ability to maintain two completely separate realities simultaneously, without allowing either to contaminate the other. The relationship did not survive the arrest. This requires no elaboration. What does require reflection is the casino's role, not as a legal matter, which the New Jersey Casino Control Commission addressed with its fine and its subsequent regulatory changes, but as a moral one. Caesars Atlantic City had a player who visited every week, who lost consistently, who was betting at levels that could not be explained by any legitimate income source the casino was aware of, and who kept returning with more money every time. The casino flew him from Toronto. The casino provided comps. The casino extended credit. The casino had hosts whose job was to ensure his continued presence. At what point does the structure of that relationship constitute something more than passive benefiting from another person's problem? The New Jersey regulators answered that question in terms of regulatory compliance. The casino had specific obligations it did not meet. The moral answer is less tidy, because the casino industry as a whole is built on a model that benefits from compulsive behavior while maintaining, as a formal posture, that responsible gambling is a priority. The tension between those two things does not resolve easily, and the Molony case put that tension under a sharper light than most cases of its era. He is in his late 60s now. He has given interviews over the years, though not frequently. He has talked about the addiction with the specificity of someone who has spent considerable time understanding it, not excusing it, not minimizing it, but mapping it accurately. He has said that the money was never really the point, that at no stage of the 2 years was he conscious of having stolen $10 million in any way that felt like $10 million. It felt like fuel. It felt like the means of continuing. The casino, the table, the hand, that was real. The money was abstract, a number in an account that he was converting into something concrete and immediate and consuming. The concrete and immediate and consuming thing is gone. The $10 million is gone. The bank absorbed the loss, distributed it across insurance mechanisms and regulatory consequences, and the ordinary arithmetic of institutional resilience. The casino kept its winnings, paid its fine, and continued operating for decades afterward. Caesars Atlantic City is still there, still operating on the same boardwalk, under corporate ownership that has changed multiple times since 1982. Brian Molony's career in banking lasted less than a decade. His addiction cost him his freedom for several years, his relationship, his professional future, and his position as a person who had done nothing wrong. What it gave him, if the concept of a gift is permissible in this context, was a knowledge of the interior of compulsive gambling so complete and so precisely mapped that it became, eventually, useful to people who had not yet lost everything, but were moving in that direction. That usefulness is not $10 million. It is not even close, but it is something. And in the quiet accounting of a life lived after a very large mistake, something is not nothing. The loans are still being processed in the offices of the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. The systems have been tightened. The controls have been strengthened. The gaps that Brian Molony walked through in 1980 have been located and closed, in the way that institutions always close gaps after someone has demonstrated at considerable cost exactly where they are. The baccarat table does not care about any of this. It never did. The shoe is shuffled, the hand is dealt, the result is what it is. And somewhere in the mathematics of all those hands across all those weekends, $10 million disappeared into a casino on the New Jersey boardwalk. And a quiet man with good number skills flew home to Toronto on Sunday night, and nobody noticed a thing. Until they did.